Many of you already know my story. I was targeted, stalked, isolated, groomed, and repeatedly raped as a minor by a known serial pedophile. Child sexual abuse is the epitome of evil. It is also disturbingly common, perpetrated not by monsters on the fringes of society, but by everyday citizens hiding in plain sight. 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls is abused before their 18th birthday. We tend to think of child sexual abuse in terms of physical acts, but in reality it is mostly invisible, characterised by calculated, insidious, systematic, psychological manipulation that leaves its survivors with lasting, internalised, complex trauma. Trauma that is not only reinforced by negative social attitudes, but also, ironically, by the various systems and institutions, the structures designed to protect us, to bring justice, like the courts, like the press. Such is the vicious cycle, or rather tangled web, of abuse culture. And thus we see the effects of abuse persist long after abuse itself stops. And wherever they can, abusers will turn survivors and their supporters against each other. One of the key objectives of perpetrators and their defenders is to maintain control of the narrative by denying, twisting, or completely rewriting the truth. As a result, survivors remain trapped in a seemingly inescapable state of repeated self-justification. By design, those who are already exhausted and traumatised become exponentially so, ceding more and more power to abusers in the process. Our pain is their strength. But by the same token, our strength is their pain. The higher we rise, the harder they try to regain control. Why, just the other day, someone online called me a horrible, horrible person who aggressively pursued her teacher and then blamed everyone else. I've lost count of how many times I've had to say this now, but the man who abused me was at my high school from 1992 until I reported him in 2011. His first successful target was in 1993, and the school knew this before I was born. I've spoken with 3 others he took advantage of before my time, and countless other women and men who bore witness to his predatory behaviour during his 18-year tenure, who, now wishing they hadn't, turned a blind eye. Who, now wishing they hadn't, smiled through it. Along with 28 multimedia files of child abuse material, which included 9 files of videos of adults penetrating children, the police found a trophy file of students, both in uniform and topless, on his computer, all of whom either came from broken homes like me or lived in the boarding house away from their families. And among the items that were assumed to be mine that were given back to me after the investigation was an envelope full of my own hair. But sure, I was the predator. It was all my fault. If I can still be shamed into believing that today, it's no wonder that even amid this national reckoning, with all the empowerment it has generated for survivors, many still remain hesitant to publicly come forward with their stories. Sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and domestic violence are all linked by this common thread of abuse of power. But each of these traumas is markedly different. The benefit in relating them is that it connects us as a community. But the dangers in conflating them include erasing individual experiences and undermining the need for tailored solutions. One of the more complex challenges I've faced in my work is walking the fine line between sexual assault and child sexual abuse survivor advocacy. Sexual assault is a distinctly gendered issue, and whilst I happily lend my voice to it, I'm not just an advocate for women. I am an advocate for all survivors of child sexual abuse, many of whom are male. We must preserve that nuance, every nuance in our discussions. We cannot forget our boys and we cannot forget our men, not only as welcome, equal participants in this ongoing conversation, and without ignoring many negative patriarchal customs. We cannot forget our boys and men who are fellow survivors of abuse. Yes, statistics say that perpetrators are more often than not men. Yes, statistics say that women are overrepresented in the survivor category. But statistics are not people. People are people, not political footballs, not disposable news items, people. This year, I've seen how even the most seemingly common sense movements are lost in translation because others deliberately misrepresent them and then project division onto them that isn't even real. For instance, certain members of the commentariat have consistently labelled me as politically divisive, failing to mention that I spent most of last year having frank, productive meetings with politicians on all sides at both the state and federal level. So, after a year of being re-victimised, commodified, objectified, sensationalised, delegitimised, misquoted, gaslit and thrown under the bus by the biased mainstream media, despite my inclusive messaging, I would just like to take this opportunity to have a glass of water. And thank you for reminding me that I really have nothing to lose. On that note, brace yourselves. On the 17th of August last year, not 5 months after being named Australian of the Year, I received a threatening phone call from a senior member of a government-funded organisation asking for my word that I wouldn't say anything damning about the Prime Minister on the evening of the next Australian of the Year Awards. You're an influential person. He'll have a fear, they said. A fear? What kind of fear? I asked myself. A fear for our nation's most vulnerable? A fear for the future of our planet? And then I heard the words, you know, with an election coming soon. And it crystallised. A fear. A fear for himself and no one else. A fear that he might lose his position, or more to the point, his power. Sound familiar to anyone? Well, it does to me. I remember standing in the shadow of a trusted authority figure being threatened in just the same veiled way. I remember him saying, "I'll lose my job if anyone hears about this, and you wouldn't want that, would you?" No. What I wanted in that moment is the same thing I want right now, and that is an end to the darkness, an end to sexual violence, safety, equity, respect, a better future for all of us. Peace, a future driven by unity and truth, not one dictated authoritatively under the politics of division and spin. Shared freedoms. How beautiful, for instance, is the freedom of speech. I haven't always had it. Many still don't. So if those of us with a voice don't use it to fight for what is right, to fight for those without a voice, then what hope is there? What is the point of platforms like this? What is the point of life if not to connect, to communicate honestly and openly with one another in the pursuit of progress with whatever means possible? What is the point of awarding someone for their work only to stifle them while they do it when it gets too real? I'm here because I made a conscious decision to stand up to evil, and I have been calling out injustice ever since. To retreat into silence now would be hypocritical. What's more, we are still seeing it pervasively, subliminally weaponized. As far as I'm concerned, you either fight it or you are a part of it. Last time I was in this room, I was goaded into making a comment about Scott's response to Brittany's allegations, despite the MC's stern warning that the topic was out of bounds. In the end, I said, it shouldn't take having children to have a conscience, and also having children doesn't guarantee a conscience. Not long afterward, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet conducted a review into the National Australia Day Council's selection process for the Australian of the Year Awards, a transparent intimidation tactic designed to rattle the cage of an organisation whose funding mostly comes from the federal government. The Australian of the Year Awards program is an institution. So too is our parliament. So too is democracy. I respect that wholeheartedly. But politicians, like all individuals, are fallible, human. And although we, the people, elect them, as per the institution of democracy, to be our leaders, our examples, it is ultimately up to them what they choose to be examples of, whether they respect the privilege and purpose of this power or whether they abuse it at our expense. They may either be constructive or destructive, but every single one of them is inarguably replaceable, like me. So why put my reputation on the line? Because when we act with integrity, the tide rises with us. When we act with integrity, we set a more esteemed bar for those who take our place. In any event, I would rather go down as a disappointment to an institution than sell out as a pandering political puppet to the corrupt forces that coercively control it. Repeatedly this year, I have seen the patterns of deception and deceit performed by predators mimicked in our halls of power. And that's just it. The federal government's approach to social issues seems to consist of nothing but empty announcements, placatory platitudes, superficial last-minute acknowledgements, and carefully staged photo ops. Facades and false hope. Reviews, reports, delays and distractions, if not downright denials. All deliberate spin tactics designed to satiate the press and the general public. And so I conclude with something, hopefully, more constructive to take away. I conclude with 3 key asks to better our nation. The first is for a government that takes the issue of abuse in all its forms seriously. In regards to the sexual abuse of children and others, there can be no progress without accountability, as Brittany said, unless our leaders take full responsibility for their own failings. Abuse culture will continue to thrive inside Parliament, setting a corrupt standard for the rest of the nation. It rots from the top. And by full responsibility, I mean proactive, preventative measures, not these reactive Band-Aid electioneering stunts like acknowledging past harm at the last minute. If you don't take a strong stance to condemn abuse, you enable it. Lest I mention the symbolism of promoting an alleged rapist, protecting him from an independent inquiry, and then allowing him to receive $1 million worth of anonymous donations to pay his personal legal fees. The second ask is for adequate funding to be actually implemented, not just announced or committed to, for prevention, education, to stop all of this before it actually starts. The federal government is prepared to spend over $90 billion taxpayer dollars on submarines that might be ready by 2040 to combat a potential offshore threat. 2.4 billion of that has already been wasted, gone. Now, compare that to what they're prepared to spend on the very real epidemic of violence against women and children affecting 1 in 4 today here at home. Just 1.1 billion in total. And if we just single out prevention education, which is where the real hope for change is, the numbers are even sadder. In 2019, the federal government announced it would spend just 2.8 million over a 3-year period, delivering a sexual and domestic violence prevention education program in schools called Respect Matters. But in reality, less than half of that amount was given without explanation. As my friend Shana Bremner, founder of End Rape on Campus Australia, pointed out, there's around 4 million students enrolled in schools across the nation, according to the ABS. So, from 2020 until 2022, if you divide the 1.36 million they actually gave by 4 million students, it works out that the federal government had planned to spend 11 cents per student per year on prevention education. 11 cents per student. This is because we currently have a government that is primarily concerned with short-sighted, votes-based funding, not with long-term, needs-based funding. And what we need in order to create real change is meaningful investment in our children, in their education, because they are the future of our nation. And the third ask is for national, consistent, legislative change. Still today, perpetrators of abuse find safety in outdated, inconsistent legislation, which both protects them and perpetuates social ignorance. For example, the man who abused me, who I spoke about before, was convicted of maintaining a sexual relationship with a person under the age of 17. In other jurisdictions, this exact same offence was called the persistent sexual abuse of a child. The former charge implies consent, while the latter reflects the gravity and the truth of an unlawful criminal act committed against an innocent child victim. Piece by piece, we must correct the narrative and take control away from abusers who have for so long sought solace in our systems and institutions that shield them from the full extent of what they've done. These changes are achievable. The hashtag #LetHerSpeak campaign, created and run by Nina Fennell, led to Tasmania not only reforming its gag law, but also the wording of the offence to persistent child sexual abuse. And as a direct result of the Grace Tame Foundation's Harmony campaign to create greater consistency between the state and territories on sexual assault legislation, this week, the ACT's Attorney General, Shane Rattenbury, is introducing the Family Violence Legislation Amendment Bill to the Legislative Assembly. One of the key amendments in the bill, which we called for on the 12th of November, is to change the name of the offence sexual relationship with a child to persistent sexual abuse of a child, and that's because of our work. Now, whilst I commend the ACT on overhauling these laws, we need to ensure that every state and territory adopts the best practice model of not only the charge itself, but the complete wording of the legislation. Tasmania, New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia have all adopted the wording of persistent sexual abuse. But Victoria and Western Australia are the only 2 jurisdictions in which the word relationship does not appear anywhere in the body of the legislation. We still have so much work to do. It's all well and good to change hearts and minds with our conversations, but without structural change, we will continue to be at the mercy of systems that override them. Now, let me restate those 3 key asks. The first is for a government that takes the issue of abuse in all its forms seriously. The second is for the implementation of adequate funding for prevention education to stop these things before they even start. The third is for national, consistent, structural change. we still have so much work to do. But in saying all of this, before we end today, we mustn't forget how far we've come. In just 12 short months, we've collectively shifted the dial towards survivor voices. We have amplified lived experience to unprecedented levels, and in doing so, restored courage and hope back to a previously disempowered community. We are on the path to achieving nationwide safety, equity, and respect. An advocate is only as powerful as their supporters. You see me here standing tall, if a little bit broken, standing on the shoulders of giants, side by side with Brittany, side by side with all of you, together, making change, making history, but above all else, making noise.